I don't expect that the recounts in Wisconsin or Michigan will change the tallies much. You'll note that I never argued that the elections were being rigged by a foreign power, or the voting machines were suspect, although there's those undervotes that are kind of funny, or the data was being altered with the possible exception of early voters coming in to change their votes, which I think should be investigated. What I argued was that the polls were obviously being manipulated to exaggerate white voter turnout and minimize turnout from non-white voters. And this indicated that there was an understanding in the background, and where that understanding was coming from suggested deep state intelligence collusion, that voter suppression tactics were going to swing the outcome of the election. The media used terms like likely voters as code words and jargon. What they meant was that they expected that the minority vote was going to be suppressed. So the polls would come out on CNN and they just erase the minorities from the voting results, and then all of a sudden the vote, it's, Clinton's 8-point lead has been erased because they just don't count the minorities. I initially thought it was bad modeling, but what they were doing was they were modeling the voter suppression that they knew was happening. And then they say things like minorities are less likely to vote. They're less likely to vote because their votes don't count, right? I didn't argue that the tactics weren't used in North Carolina or Florida or Arizona either. What I argued is that the margins in these states make the manipulation less obvious, and that it will consequently be a lot harder to prove. Resources should be focused on the places where the fraud is most obvious, and that would be in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And I'm actually going to take a step back from Michigan. Put another way, the polls predicted that the results in North Carolina and Arizona and Florida were going to be close enough that the systemic bias could be explained solely in the margins of error. Basically, they could cheat in these states and get away with it, because polling is not perfect. It was not true in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, or in Michigan, where Clinton was ahead by margins that exceeded any reasonable error. You'd have to rely on not just a systemic bias, but also on an unreasonably large shy Trump voter effect in these states that was consistent through all polling and even the exit polling. Even when they took the minorities out, even when they manipulated it for that effect, Clinton was still winning in these states. So either people were lying to the polling firms consistently for months, and the data reflected it, or they weren't, and votes were destroyed. Which sounds more likely to you? That people were lying to the firms consistently for months, and you'll read academic reports on this that try to argue that the reason the polls were wrong was because the people that were surveyed were lying. Do you think that's more likely, or do you think that it's more likely that, hey, they just didn't count these votes? I think that, government corruption is far more likely than mass spontaneous lying. It was a weather balloon. I initially just thought they were using bad modeling. It took me time to realize that what should have been bad modeling was actually at the least predictive due to the understanding that the election was going to be stolen through voter intimidation and discarded ballots. They were modeling voter suppression. And that voter suppression that they modeled actually happened. What that means is that the paper trail is probably in provisional ballots, if it exists, but there's no guarantee that it's there at all, right? There's probably no way to prove it. A proper accounting would no doubt yield a correct result, but it would take a long time, and probably break privacy laws. And those ballots may very well have just been destroyed, burned. I don't expect that there's going to be any way to prove that it was stolen, other than to point at the polling discrepancies, which are overwhelming, and argue that this is fishy, And to point out that the media seems to have seen it coming. The polling discrepancies are absurd, like outlandish. And then you've got a media that seems to have understood that Trump was the preferred establishment candidate. When you put those two things together, it's entirely circumstantial. It would never hold up in a court of law. But, there's lots of things that happen that you can't try, right? It's the perfect crime. This idea that, if there's no evidence that it didn't happen, well, it was an inside job, and these guys are pros. They know what they're doing. They didn't leave a smoking gun at the polling booth. You can look for days, for weeks, for months, you won't find it. It's not that Trump's vote totals are higher. They're not. He got less votes than Romney. Okay? So if you look at the previous election and this election, and you see the conservative numbers are just flat. What you see is this crater for the Democrats. And that crater was not predicted in polling, unless you count the manipulation that they used. It wasn't predicted in the raw data. It wasn't predicted by the census professionals. And in fact, if you looked on the early voting, there were record numbers of early voters. And yet, somehow at the end, turnout has gone down, despite all evidence implying that it was increasing. It really seems to be that millions and millions and millions of votes for Clinton just disappeared. They weren't flipped. They weren't converted. They just disappeared. And if they disappeared, then they disappeared. Without a trace. You're not going to find them. They're not in a school gym in Scranton. They're not behind a block of cheese in Madison. They're gone. But I want to, I don't think this was Trump's cronies showing up with baseball bats and giving people offers that they can't refuse. This was not some crude mafia job, This was coordinated. And I think they cleaned up. I think they destroyed the evidence. Because all evidence before the election pointed to interference by the deep state, by professionals, by the FBI, by the background media. That ABC poll was that's when I knew, right? ABC/CIA tracking poll. That's when you knew that he's got the real establishment behind him here. And they don't fuck up like that. Well, they picked the wrong guy. They fucked up. But they've done this before. They've done this in foreign countries. They've done this here, and they know how to do it. And you'll never unravel it. They don't leave evidence behind for you to catch them. If you're lucky, okay, you might be able to find data that indicates that ballots were destroyed. That's your best guess. If you're looking for something, and it's probably too late now, but if you're looking for something, what you should be looking for, take this for the next time it happens, and it will happen again. What you should be looking for is some kind of evidence that ballots were destroyed. Look in the in the dumpsters in the back. Try to find shredded papers that you can't otherwise explain. Files that have been dated later than they should be. You're not going to find the ballots themselves, but if you look hard enough, you might find evidence that indicates that they were destroyed. And that might be useful in passing reforms. But again, I say that like it's some kind of accident, like there wasn't a cleanup crew. There was a cleanup crew, and they were pros, and they did their job, of course. And so, if you listen to what I'm saying, it kind of sounds like I'm saying that the United States is some kind of military dictatorship with a fraudulent veneer of fake elections designed to trick people into thinking that they live in a democracy in order to prevent a real revolution. Are you saying that? Of course I'm saying that. I'm saying that for years. Look at American foreign policy. It destroys democracy everywhere it finds it. You think it wants it at home? Of course it doesn't. But I want to be clear. What makes this election different is not that it was stolen. Okay? Elections are stolen in the United States all of the time. And there's been a few in Canada that I'm skeptical about as well. The BC election. I guess it was the last one. The 2000 election was stolen. The Supreme Court. The 1980 election was stolen. The 1968 election was stolen. And the 1960 election was stolen too. Okay, that's 3 Republicans and a Democrat before the Civil Rights Movement. And before 1960, well, there wasn't really a CIA yet. There was the Office of Strategic Services. The deep state that I'm relying on to explain this did not exist before Eisenhower. It was Eisenhower that warned us of it, if you'll recall, in that famous speech. What makes this election different is that they didn't care anymore. There's like no effort to pretend that what they were saying made any sense. You really think Donald Trump won in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania? These are blue states. These are union states. That's ridiculous. And this rhetoric that he's the candidate of the working class, it's nonsense. He's an upper class dipshit. An upper class douchebag. He's the same fucking thing as Mitt Romney. His numbers with that demographic was the same as Mitt Romney. He didn't do better with union workers than Mitt Romney. That's a lie. What happened was a lot less black people and a lot less Latinos voted. And the difference between female voting, the difference between what women claimed they were going to vote for and what they actually voted for was very large. But there was no increase in support for Donald Trump in the white working class. That's a lie. There was merely a decrease in support for Clinton amongst minorities. And so what makes this election different is that they stole states that were obviously not in play. Pennsylvania was not in play, and Wisconsin was not in play. The difference is how brazen they were, and how much contempt that they showed for voters in the process. And if that is a harbinger for the future, then expect the elections in the United States to be no different than the ones in the Soviet Union. Our American perestroika may usher in an era of authoritarianism.